What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Acel Spades. I have had a lot of fantasy football content going over the last couple weeks as we're getting ready for that fantasy football season to start up in the upcoming days. But I'm also launching Fantasy Basketball 201, which is a fantasy basketball advice podcast as well that you could check out as well. So the purpose of this video that I'm going to be doing to start off fantasy basketball content is giving you 7 strategies to help you win your fantasy basketball championship. So much like I talked about in fantasy football, I release content on 5 strategies to help you in fantasy football. These are 7 geared towards fantasy basketball. I really love NBA, really love basketball, and I'm excited to get into fantasy as well that I will be releasing on this channel. So expectation, there's a lot of stuff that is not settled yet in the NBA in terms of who is going to sign on which team. We have restricted free agents. The offseason has kind of dragged along, as you may see. There's going to be things that change, but what I want to do in September is give you an overview of the conferences, how I think each team will do. I'll give you some previews, and then we'll start doing some mocks later in the month. So if you're interested in more content like this, subscribe to the channel. I not only do fantasy content, but I also release Christian music. I also do song reactions as well. So please take advantage of that. Check out my channel and subscribe. So I will be doing 7 strategies to help you win a fantasy basketball championship. So before I get into this, I'm going to give you my quick breakdown for fantasy basketball, much like I did with fantasy football in hopefully 30 seconds. You have a point guard, a shooting guard, a small forward, a power forward, a center. You have multiple utility players, which are a combination of any of those. Fantasy basketball is more complicated, though, than football. In terms of football is generally all cumulative points, but fantasy basketball is much more so versatile in terms of you have points leagues in which you have a variety of points that can be scored. You just sum up all the stats together into a point total, much like fantasy football. You have categories in which you are competing with your opponents on total number of points, field goal percentage, rebounds, assists, blocks, steals, free throws, 3-point percentage, whatever categories your league sets it for. You also have lock-in leagues in which you lock in a singular performance. Typically that's in a point format. And you also have rotisserie leagues in which you have accumulation of individual stats that is compared throughout the season, and it gives you a point total to set you up for the playoffs. You're not really matched up with an opponent, more so matched up against the league as a whole. So fantasy basketball is a lot more versatile, but my strategy is generally the same in terms of how I target players, how I draft, and how I approach this season. So the first one that I want to talk about, much like I talked about with fantasy football, is you want to be monitoring the waiver wires daily. And I'm telling you, more so in fantasy basketball than really any fantasy sports, if you're monitoring the waiver wires daily, if you're paying attention to box scores, if you are paying attention to news as the season goes along and checking who's out there on waivers, you will generally be successful because it's a long season and a lot of people's attention, I'm just going to be honest, kind of waver off as the season progresses. So if you stay diligent about monitoring the waiver wires daily, seeing who is out there, you can get a lot of value for yourself in fantasy basketball. And that is probably one of my biggest advices, if you get nothing outside of this channel, is to monitor the waiver wire daily, and you will find value throughout the season. The fantasy basketball has tons of league winners that come off the bench, and believe it or not, that was the case this season. A best example of that is Kyle Filipowski, who went off with the Jazz when a lot of people weren't noticing after Lauri Markkanen was shut down. There's multiple examples of that, though. So, and it happens every single season. So pay attention to the waiver wires, and you will find gems out there. Number 2 strategy for fantasy basketball, you want to nail your draft. And you want to get guys that are stat stuffers with a void of opportunity on their team that leaves them as the 1 or the 2. So what I mean by that is, generally in basketball, it's different in terms of you want to have guys that can win you games. But in fantasy basketball, you're looking at the guys like the LaMelo Balls that are not winners, but guys that are going to put up a lot of different stats. LaMelo may not be the best example because of his health, but I'm talking about guys that are generally not always on the best team, but they're going to get a ton of opportunity for that particular team to not only score points, but also to get rebounds, assists, also steals, etc. So in the draft, what I'm trying to do generally is I'm trying to target guys that I think will be getting a lot of stats on their team. I'm not so much looking towards guys that are, names on a bench on a really stacked team like the Oklahoma City Thunder, unless you're getting, Chet, J-Dub or Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Unless you're getting them, there's not a ton of value that you're getting on that team, but you can get a lot of value on the teams like the Wizards or the Hornets where somebody has to step up and fill a void. So because of that, that's why I'm targeting the draft to particularly go after the stat-stuffing players. Now, which ones am I targeting? And this leads me to strategy number 3. In the draft, what I'm generally trying to do is take my guards early. A common misconception is a lot of people will want to take centers early. And if you're getting Nikola Jokic or Victor Wembanyama, then of course you do that. There is no better fantasy asset than Nikola Jokic in fantasy basketball, in my opinion, and I believe it will stay that way this year. But at the same time, getting the elite guards are great value because, as one of my later strategies will point out, you get a ton of value from the big men in the waiver wire. And I try to make sure that I get the guards that will be locked in, particularly the ones that are going to be locked in and hitting a lot of threes, like Steph Curry. As you can see back in my picture over here from back in the day, he was always somebody that I targeted for fantasy football during his elite run with the Warriors. Fantasy basketball, because of his abilities to hit threes at a clip that nobody else can get. And that is why I target the guards generally early on, is because you're not going to be replicating a lot of great guard value on the waiver wire. The elite ones that you can get in the draft are generally earlier on. So yes, I do try to get my elite centers like my Jokic's, my Wemby's, guys like that. But you also want to make sure that you're getting elite guards because you can replace a lot of center depth later on. That leads me to my next point, which is to, as I've already mentioned earlier, you want to go for a guy that is a 2 on a bad team over a guy that is a 4 or 5 on a great team. And what I mean by that is that the guy that is, the Cam Thomas, somebody that is a stat stuffer on a team that is headed for the lottery, is going to give you a ton of value for the number of stats he may put up. Michael Porter Jr. on the same team is a good example of that for this year. He's somebody that will probably put up a lot of stats to be on a bad team, maybe drafted a little bit later than some guys like, a Derek White or somebody to that effect. Maybe Alec Caruso because he's on a great team and he's well known. But they're not going to realistically get a ton of stats that will necessarily give you elite production for fantasy. So generally what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find those guys that I think will have the ball in their hands a lot during games, or guys that will be in clear voids at the center position in which they can get a lot of rebounds for you. Even if they're on the really bad teams, you're not necessarily looking for the best names. You're looking for the guys that have the best opportunity to help fill your key positions for you in fantasy. And my number 5 point is, as I've already mentioned earlier, you could always find great center depth on the waiver wire. Kyle Filipowski was an example I mentioned earlier. Joel Embiid, when he was injured, led the opportunity for Andre Drummond or even a Dembona late in the season. And that is why it's important to continue to monitor the waiver wires as well, is because you find, if you're paying attention, you find a lot of guys late that are especially helpful for you to help you win your championship when other guys may not necessarily be noticing the nitty-gritty details of what's happening on each team. That leads me to my 6th point, is consider the secondary effects of injuries and trade in the NBA trade deadline. So one of the most underrated moments in the NBA season for fantasy is the trade deadline, and not because of the guys getting traded to the contending teams, but because of the void that it opens up. A good example of this, so Jimmy Butler, when he was traded away from the Miami Heat, And I know he didn't really necessarily have the great statistical season because he was refusing to play, but it opened up opportunities for guys like Tyler Hero to really take advantage and become a dominant player throughout that season. Also, it opened up opportunities for Davion Mitchell. Another example of this, so the Luka Doncic trade that everybody lamented, that was the talk of the town, Luka going to the Lakers. But what it did is it opened up opportunities for Spencer Dinwiddie to become relevant as a point guard in Dallas, especially when Dallas was dealing with a ton of injuries at the time. Dinwiddie was very relevant for fantasy and startable among the guard position then. My point is that the moves that happen in fantasy that are best for you at the trade deadline are the ones of the teams leaving. So pay attention to the guys who could be filling the voids that those superstars left, because those are the ones that will be becoming great value for you in fantasy basketball as the season progresses. And that leads me to my seventh and final strategy, that fantasy basketball is a game in which if you are persistent, you generally can win out. And what I mean by this is that monitor the waiver wires daily. Look at the box scores. See which guys are going to be injured and are not going to play. Much like I said in fantasy football, Sleeper is very good at giving you alerts on which players are going to be out, which players could be trending up because of the news of people leaving. So what I would recommend for fantasy basketball as well is to really pay attention to who is going to be able to play, which guys are out there and playing better as of late, who will have a void of opportunity, and you will generally find yourself successful in this fantasy sport if you stay persistent with it, if you look for opportunities in the places where most people are not looking. You're looking at those bad teams where somebody has got to get points, somebody's got to get the assist, and that is the strategy that you can use to help you win your fantasy basketball championship in 2026. Hard to believe we're already there, or at least a couple months from there. But that is how you can win a fantasy basketball championship this season. I will be doing my Eastern Conference preview next week, so you'll see my team projections of the Eastern Conference squad, and then we will get into Western Conference after that. This is a quick video, though, just to give you the overview of my strategies to help you win a championship. So I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye.